Take off the badge, Marcus.
My wife's voice cut through the ballroom. Serena stood beside Adrian Cole in a pastel pink satin dress, her black hair pinned into that perfect bun she wore when she wanted to look untouchable. Adrian smiled.
You heard her. This party is for people who matter.
I looked down at my navy suit. Serena laughed softly. Adrian stepped closer and slapped a blue leather folder against my chest. Adrian's smile bent when he saw the old signature on the first page. And that was the first time all night my wife stopped smiling. The story did not begin in that ballroom. It began with a promise I made 12 years earlier, in a hospital room that smelled like rain and burned coffee. My sister Denise was 34 years old when she walked into an emergency room complaining of a headache and a strange heaviness on one side of her body. A tired resident told her it was probably stress and sent her home with instructions to rest. 3 days later, she collapsed in her kitchen. By the time anyone ran the right scan, the clot in her brain had already finished what it came to do. I remember the exact sound the monitor made when it flattened. A single tone that did not rise or fall, just stayed level the way silence does when it has nothing left to interrupt. I remember a nurse touching my shoulder and asking if there was anyone she could call. I remember thinking, with the strange clarity grief sometimes gives you before it lets itself be felt, that the machine beside her bed had recorded every heartbeat of her decline in exact detail, and not one person had been trained to read what it was already trying to say. I was a biomedical systems engineer back then, the kind of quiet technical person nobody at a party asks about twice. I built monitoring software for diagnostic machines. I understood signal patterns the way some men understand engines. And standing in that hospital room, holding my sister's hand as it went cold, I understood something else. The machines around her bed had likely seen the warning signs long before any human did. Nobody had taught them to speak up loud enough. I did not go back to my old job after the funeral. I built something instead. For almost 2 years, in a rented office above a laundromat, I wrote what would later be called the Ellison Signal Protocol, a way of reading subtle irregularities in heart rhythm and blood flow that most equipment was tuned to ignore. It would not have made Denise's headache dramatic enough to notice. It would have flagged the smaller signal underneath it, the one a machine catches even when an exhausted resident does not. Nobody wanted it at first. I pitched it to 4 different device manufacturers in those 2 years, and I remember sitting across from men in nicer suits than mine who nodded politely and then explained, in one form or another, that the margins on rural and low-income diagnostics were too thin to justify the engineering cost. One investor told me, not unkindly, that I should consider a version of this for people who can actually pay for it. I did not take his money. I kept the software the way I had built it, because I had not built it to satisfy a margin. I had built it to catch the thing a tired resident misses at 2 in the morning. At the time, Helios Meridian Systems was a struggling medical device startup with 3 months of payroll left and a diagnostic platform that could not find a buyer. I brought them the protocol because their hardware was the only hardware built to carry it. I did not ask for a title. I asked for one condition written into the licensing agreement in language a corporate lawyer tried twice to strike out. and I refused to sign until it stayed in. This clause will complicate every future deal you ever try to make, the lawyer told me across a conference table, tapping the page with 2 fingers like he was trying to physically press the sentence out of existence. Investors don't like permanent obligations. Then they can find another protocol, I told him. It was the only leverage I had, and it was the only leverage I needed. Because without the technology, Helios had 90 days left before its own investors walked away entirely. The company would be required, permanently, to make the diagnostic technology available at reduced cost to free clinics and rural providers. Not as a donation program that could be quietly ended in a bad fiscal quarter, as a binding term of the agreement itself, tied to my consent as the original author. I signed the document with a navy fountain pen I had bought the week after Denise's funeral, and that pen never left my jacket pocket again. The protocol saved the company. Within 18 months, Helios went from a business people avoided to a business people wanted a piece of. I sat in on exactly 1 board meeting during that stretch, the night the first hospital network signed on after seeing the early detection data, and I watched men who had been ready to shut the company down 3 months earlier suddenly talk about Helios's long-term vision as though they had believed in it the whole time. Nobody mentioned the 90 days. Nobody mentioned the lawyer who tried to strike my clause twice. I did not correct them. I never wanted the spotlight that came with it. I preferred being the man in the back of the room who understood how the machine worked rather than the man on stage explaining why it mattered. I stayed on as a quiet technical advisor, and I let the company build its public story around executives who liked cameras more than I did. Serena was not one of those executives yet. When I met her, she was sharp, funny, and hungry in the way ambitious people are hungry before the world has decided whether to feed them. She worked in a marketing department at a firm across town, writing press releases nobody read for a company that was going nowhere. I liked her mind before I liked anything else about her. I liked that she noticed things. When Helios needed someone to shape its public communications after the turnaround, I gave her name to a hiring director I knew, quietly, the way I did most things. I never told her. I did not want her gratitude. I wanted her to walk into that building believing every door had opened because of her own talent, because in every way that mattered, it had. My name just happened to be the reason the door existed at all. She climbed fast, and she deserved to. Within a few years, she ran corporate communications for the entire company. We built a life during those years that I still think of as the good years, before the pastel pink gowns and the galas, back when she used to fall asleep with press drafts still open on her laptop and ask me what I thought about the wording. I told her the truth then. She usually listened. I remember one night early on, before either of us had any money worth mentioning, when she read me a paragraph she had written about a small clinic partnership and asked what was wrong with it. I told her it sounded like it was written for investors instead of patients. She rewrote the whole thing by morning, and the version she sent out was the one Raymond himself later called the best press release the company had ever issued. She never forgot to thank me for a note like that back then. I do not say this to score points against her now. I say it because it is the clearest memory I have of who we used to be to each other. I stepped further back from the company as it grew, partly by nature and partly because of something that happened not long after the turnaround. A journalist wrote a story about the genius behind Helios, painted me as some kind of reluctant messiah, and the company's board loved the attention so much they wanted to build a whole campaign around my face. I hated it. I had built the protocol to save people who could not afford ordinary care, not to become a mascot for the company that sold it. I sat across from the marketing director and two board members in a glass conference room and told them plainly that I would not be the face of a campaign built around my sister's death. "People will connect with a founder's story," the director said, sliding a mock-up across the table with my photograph already inserted above a headline about visionary leadership. I slid it back without looking at it twice. "Then find a story that isn't mine," I told him. I asked to be left out of future materials, and legally, because of how the agreement was structured, they had no choice but to honor it. So the world slowly forgot that Marcus Ellison had anything to do with Helios Meridian Systems at all. I thought Serena still remembered. I was wrong about how much. Adrian Cole joined the company 9 years after I stepped back, and he understood something about corporate theater that I never did. He knew how to stand near cameras. He knew how to say the word vision in a way that made investors lean forward. I met him exactly once before any of this started, at a small dinner for department heads, and he shook my hand with the practiced grip of a man who had shaken 1,000 hands and needed all of them to remember him fondly. "The famous silent partner," he said when Serena introduced me, in a tone I could not quite place at the time, but understood perfectly in hindsight. Within 2 years, he was Executive Vice President of Strategic Growth, and everyone assumed his path to Chief Executive was only a matter of time. He had a way of remembering small details about people, a spouse's name, a child's upcoming birthday, and repeating them back at exactly the right moment to make a room feel like he had been paying attention to them personally for years. I watched him do it to investors, to junior staff, to Raymond himself. I did not think much of it at first. Charm is not a crime. It only became something else once I understood what he was willing to trade away underneath it. Serena met him during merger talks with a hospital network, and I remember the first night she came home talking about him the way she used to talk about ideas she was excited by. "He actually understands where healthcare is going," she said. I said that was good. I meant it. Over the following months, she mentioned him more and more, always framed as a colleague, always attached to some detail about strategy or investor sentiment I had no reason to question. There was a dinner with the merger team I did not attend, one she described afterward as mostly boring, though she brought up something Adrian had said at that dinner 3 separate times over the following week. I did not think anything of it for a long time, because I trusted her, and because I had never given her a reason not to trust me. The small things started quietly enough that I almost let them pass. At a company dinner, she straightened my navy tie and murmured, "Maybe don't talk too much tonight, okay?" I laughed it off. A few weeks later, I overheard Adrian introduce me to an investor as Serena's husband. He's very supportive, in a tone that made supportive sound like a diagnosis. Then he started calling me the quiet husband whenever I was in earshot, always with a smile, always in front of enough people that correcting him would have made me look thin-skinned instead of him look unkind. At a holiday dinner that winter, Serena seated me at the far end of a long table, near two junior associates I had never met, while she sat beside Adrian near the head of the table, discussing seating arrangements for an investor summit, as though it were the two of them hosting the evening, instead of the two of us. When I mentioned it afterward, gently, she told me I was reading into things that weren't there. I let it go, the way I had let go of most things by then. Though I noticed I was doing the letting go more and more, and she was doing less and less of the noticing. I did not fight these moments, because I did not think they were worth fighting. I had spent years building a life where I did not need a room full of strangers to confirm what I already knew about myself. But I noticed when Serena stopped correcting Adrian, and then I noticed when she started laughing along. The late nights came next, the way they always do in these stories, and I hate that I am not more original here. She started staying past 9 most evenings, past 10 some nights, always for reasons that made sense individually and only became strange in total. Her phone began living face down on the counter. One evening, it lit up while she was in the shower, and I was not looking for anything, I promise you that, but I could not help seeing the words on the screen. "He doesn't belong in the room you're about to enter." I did not confront her that night. I am not built that way. I watched instead the way I had spent my whole career watching signals other people missed. A week later, she came home from what she called a strategy retreat with a new way of talking about the company, phrases that sounded borrowed rather than hers, words like unlocking valuation and narrative momentum that Adrian used in every meeting I had ever sat through. She laughed differently, too. Lighter, quicker. The way people laugh when they are performing ease instead of feeling it. I told myself I was imagining a shape in the static. I have spent my whole career trained not to ignore a signal just because I do not like what it might mean, and I broke that rule for her longer than I'm proud of. What I found was worse than an affair, though the affair was real too. Serena had started drafting internal materials describing Adrian as the strategic mind behind Helios's diagnostic future, language that quietly erased the origin of the very technology paying for the marble floors we were standing on at every gala. I understood erasing my name from a press release. I had asked for that once. But I began digging further because something about the timing bothered me, and I found the real problem buried in a folder of deal documents tied to the upcoming hospital network partnership. Adrian was restructuring the licensing terms of the Ellison Signal Protocol as part of the new deal, and the revised language quietly removed the low-cost compatibility requirements for rural and free clinics, the exact clause I had refused to remove 12 years earlier. He was trading away the one condition that gave the whole project meaning in exchange for a cleaner valuation number that would look better to the hospital network's investors. I read through 3 drafts of the term sheet that night at my kitchen table, and each version stripped a little more of the original language than the last, the way someone tests how much they can remove before anyone with authority notices. I called Maya Whitcomb, the attorney who had represented my interests since the original agreement. She read the revised terms twice and told me plainly that if Adrian pushed this version through, the company would be in direct violation of the original consent provision, the one that still required my signature for any material change to distribution terms. I had the legal right to stop it. Maya also told me something I already suspected. If I moved too early, Adrian would simply rewrite the paperwork again and bury his tracks deeper. "Let him announce it publicly first," she said. "Public commitments are much harder to quietly erase." "And if he announces it and nobody stops him?" I asked her. "Then you stop him," she said, quietly, in front of the fewest people possible, with paper instead of anger. That's the only version of this that doesn't turn you into the villain of your own story. So I waited. I let Adrian believe he had already won. Those weeks were harder than anything in the ballroom that followed. Waiting is not the same thing as peace. I went to work every day, ate dinner across the table from a woman I still loved in some complicated way, and said nothing about the folder of evidence sitting in Maya's office. Because I understood that the moment I spoke, the truth would stop belonging to me and start belonging to whatever story Adrian decided to tell about it first. Dignity, I have learned, sometimes looks a great deal like silence from the outside. It rarely feels like silence on the inside. The 25th anniversary party arrived on a Friday evening in a hotel ballroom in Chicago. All gold light and string quartet, doctors and investors and board members circulating with champagne, while a $600 million partnership sat unannounced in the air, like a held breath. Serena wore pastel pink, as she always did for events that mattered to her, and I wore the same navy suit I always wore, because I had never needed a different color to know who I was. At the door, a young security guard named Jamal handed me a temporary guest badge instead of the executive credential I usually received. I did not make a scene about it. I clipped it to my pocket and walked in, because I already knew what I was carrying in my jacket meant more than any badge a printer could produce. Inside, the ballroom looked exactly like every gala Helios had ever thrown, which is to say, it looked like money trying very hard to look like taste. A 25-foot banner celebrating a quarter-century of innovation and impact hung behind the stage, flanked by screens cycling through photographs of the flagship device in hospitals I had never visited. Doctors in evening wear traded business cards near the bar. Investors laughed too loudly at things that were not especially funny. I recognized almost none of the younger executives circulating the room, and none of them recognized me at all. Adrian took the stage early in the evening and gave a toast about vision, about growth, about bold leadership carrying Helios into its next era. He talked about reimagining diagnostic access for the next 25 years, and thanked a list of executives that did not include a single name from the company's first decade. "None of this happens," he said, raising his glass toward Raymond, "without people willing to bet on the future instead of clinging to the past." A few people near me clapped. He never said my name, not once, though the technology he described so proudly had my sister's death written into its architecture. I stood near the back of the room and listened to a version of my own life being told by a stranger, and I felt something settle in my chest that was not anger. It was patience finally running out of road. Serena found me first near the coat check, alone, before Adrian had joined us. For a moment, she looked almost like the woman I married, before the pastel pink armor fully settled back into place. "Please don't make tonight complicated," she said quietly, glancing toward the stage where the partnership announcement was scheduled. I told her I had no intention of making anything complicated. She studied my face for a second longer than she needed to, as though some old instinct in her almost recognized that I meant something specific by that. And then Adrian's voice called her name from across the room, and whatever she almost asked me stayed unasked. Serena found me near the champagne table not long after, and that is where the confrontation you already heard begins. She told me to take off the badge. Adrian told me the party was for people who mattered. I told him he had asked security to print that badge for me himself. Serena laughed and said she felt sorry for me. Somewhere behind us, a stranger whispered the question that had been following me quietly for years. "Isn't that her husband?" Adrian pressed the blue leather folder against my chest and told me to sign the apology and leave. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because quiet dignity is not the same thing as feeling nothing. I felt exactly what you would expect a man to feel, standing in a room full of people who had decided he was furniture. But I had spent 12 years learning that the loudest reaction is rarely the most effective one. So I opened the folder instead of my mouth. Inside was the apology statement Adrian wanted me to sign, admitting I had caused discomfort to the executive team. Beneath it, clipped and slightly yellowed with age, was a photocopy of the original Ellison Signal Protocol licensing agreement, the very document I had signed with my Navy pen 12 years earlier. Adrian had apparently pulled it as supporting material for tonight's partnership announcement, never imagining the man standing in front of him and the name on that signature page were the same person. His smile bent the moment he saw it. Across the room, Raymond Price, the CEO who had shaken my hand exactly once in 12 years, at the closing of the very deal that saved his company, went pale and dropped his champagne glass on the marble floor. "Where did you get that document?" he asked, loud enough that the string quartet actually stopped playing. Evelyn Brooks, the 72-year-old board chair and a former federal judge who intimidated everyone in that room, including Adrian, rose from her seat near the stage without a word and began walking toward us. Serena, for the first time all night, stopped smiling. "Mr. Cole," Evelyn said, arriving beside us with the calm authority of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms. "Do you understand what you just handed him?" Adrian tried to recover, the way people like Adrian always try to recover, with confidence instead of facts. "It's old paperwork," he said, forcing a laugh that nobody in the immediate circle joined. I did not argue with him. I simply handed the folder to Evelyn, because I have learned that the truth rarely needs a lawyer standing next to it when it can speak for itself on the page. Evelyn read one line aloud: "The consent provision requiring the original author's signature for any material change to distribution terms." And the ballroom around us went quiet, in the particular way a room goes quiet when powerful people realize they might be standing on the wrong side of something. Raymond ordered the two security guards hovering nearby to step back. Nobody had said the word billionaire. Nobody needed to. The math was already rearranging itself behind every set of eyes in that circle. "Marcus," Serena whispered, her hand finding my sleeve. "What is this?" "Something you never asked about," I said. And I did not say it cruelly. I said it the way you state a fact you have carried alone for a long time. Evelyn asked me plainly what the document meant for tonight's announcement, and I gave her the short version. The agreement gave me author consent authority over the distribution terms of the protocol powering their flagship device, and the version of the deal Adrian intended to announce that evening violated the original patient access clause by removing the compatibility layer that let rural and free clinics use the technology at reduced cost. Adrian did not fold quietly. Men like Adrian rarely do. "He's not an engineer anymore," he said to the small crowd that had gathered, loud enough to be heard past our circle. "Whatever he did 12 years ago, he doesn't understand modern valuation. He doesn't understand what this deal requires." "Which version of the protocol are you selling tonight?" I asked him. He did not answer, because he could not. And a hush moved through the small crowd the way it does when a question exposes exactly how much someone does not know about the thing they are trying to sell. Raymond, to his credit, asked me to explain in front of the board members now gathering. I did not raise my voice or reach for jargon designed to impress anyone. I borrowed a cocktail napkin and the navy pen from my jacket and sketched the basic signal pathway the way I had explained it to junior engineers 100 times over the years, then circled the section Adrian's revised terms had quietly stripped out. The low-cost compatibility layer that let a small rural clinic's older equipment read the same diagnostic signal a major hospital's newest machine could read. Two physicians near the edge of the circle leaned in, recognizing exactly what I was showing them. "This is a valuation strategy," Adrian said, trying to talk over the physicians now murmuring to each other. "You're describing an engineering detail like it's a moral crisis." "It was a moral crisis before it was an engineering detail," I told him. "I just happen to also understand the engineering." One of the physicians, an older woman I did not recognize, asked me directly whether the compatibility layer could be restored without a full hardware redesign. I told her it could because I'd built it to be restored precisely for a moment like this one, though I'd never expected the moment to arrive in a ballroom. Adrian had no answer ready for a question that specific, and the silence that followed told the room more than my napkin sketch ever could. Raymond stood off to the side through most of this, arms folded, saying very little, though I noticed him watching me the way you watch someone you are only now meeting for the first time after 12 years of assuming you already knew them. "You built all of this?" he said finally, not quite a question. "The entire architecture?" I told him I had, and that I had never stopped paying attention to how it was being used, even from a distance. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when a great deal of his own history is quietly being rewritten in front of him. That was when Linda Reyes stepped forward. I did not know she was in the room. She introduced herself as a senior nurse who ran a free clinic on the south side, and she told the small crowd, in a voice steadier than mine, that her clinic had caught early warning signs in 3 patients that year using exactly the low-cost version of this device. Patients who could never have afforded the premium hospital equipment Adrian's new terms would have required instead. She described one patient in particular, a retired bus driver in his 60s who came in for a routine visit and left with a referral that likely saved him from a stroke within the week. She did not know until that moment that the man standing across from Adrian with a napkin in his hand was the reason her clinic had that machine at all. She was not performing for anyone. She was simply telling the truth about people whose names none of us in that ballroom would ever know. And for the first time that night, the conversation stopped being about business and started being about the reason the business existed at all. Serena tried once more to recover her footing, her voice tight in the way it gets when she feels a story slipping out of her control. "Marcus never told me any of this," she said to Evelyn, to Raymond, to anyone still listening. "I told you who I was every day," I said. "You were waiting for a title." "That's not fair," she said, and for a moment I saw genuine hurt behind the practiced composure. Not performance this time. Something real finally surfacing under the pressure of the room. "You could have told me. All of it. Any of it." "I did tell you," I said. "You just never asked the follow-up question, because the answer you already had was easier to live with." Nobody in that circle needed me to raise my voice for the sentence to land. I watched something break in her expression that had nothing to do with Adrian and everything to do with 12 years of assumptions finally meeting the facts. That was when Maya Whitcomb arrived, having been quietly summoned an hour earlier the moment I confirmed Adrian intended to push the announcement through that night regardless. She carried a slim folder of her own, an audit she had run on the deal packet after our earlier conversation, and she laid it open in front of Evelyn and Raymond both. Buried inside the packet was an internal memo bearing what appeared to be my signature, granting consent to the revised terms. I had never signed it. Maya pointed to the scanned signature and then to the wet ink original still sitting in the blue leather folder in Evelyn's hands, the difference obvious once you knew to look for it. She had already traced the memo's metadata back through 3 drafts, each one edited later at night than the last, the final version sent less than 72 hours before the party. "Administrative error," Adrian said, though his voice had lost the confidence it carried 20 minutes earlier. "Then why was it sent from your private account, Mr. Cole?" Maya asked, "and not through legal review like every other consent document in this packet?" Adrian turned to Serena then, as though hoping she might still rescue him the way she had rescued his reputation in every internal memo she had written that year. "Serena," he said, "tell them this is ridiculous." She did not say anything. She looked at the folder, then at me, then at the floor, and for the first time all evening, Adrian understood that the one person he had counted on to keep vouching for him had run out of things to say on his behalf. Adrian looked down at the folder he himself had handed me less than an hour before, the same folder he had used to try to humiliate me in front of 200 people, and I watched him understand in real time that he had placed the exact evidence of his own overreach directly into my hands. Raymond did not wait for the board to deliberate privately. He announced right there in the ballroom that the partnership announcement was delayed pending an internal review, and that Adrian Cole was suspended from his duties effective immediately while the board investigated the consent memo. Serena stepped back from Adrian's side without anyone asking her to, though I noticed it took her a moment longer than it should have. The board asked me to say a few words, And I want to tell you I felt triumphant standing there, but mostly I felt tired in the way you feel after carrying something heavy for a very long distance. I did not talk about Adrian. I did not talk about Serena. I talked about Denise, about the clinics, about a promise made in a hospital room that smelled like rain and burned coffee. A company can outgrow a building, I told them. It cannot outgrow the reason it was built. Then I asked for a pen, though I already had mine. I used the same navy fountain pen Adrian had tried to force onto an apology letter an hour earlier, and instead, I signed an amendment restoring the original patient access terms permanently, adding language that made the clause impossible to quietly remove again in any future deal. Adrian had wanted my signature on a letter admitting I did not belong in that room. Instead, my signature ended up protecting the exact people the room had been built to serve. Serena followed me into the hallway afterward, her pastel pink gown catching the light from the ballroom behind her. She apologized, and I believe the apology was real, in the way regret is often real once it is too late to change anything. "I didn't know you had any of this," she said. "That's the part you keep apologizing for," I told her, "but it was never the part that broke us." "Then what was it?" she asked, and her voice cracked in a way I had not heard in years. "You stopped seeing me the moment you thought you knew everything about me," I said. "The signature didn't change who I was. It only changed what you were willing to notice." She did not have an answer for that, and I did not wait for one. I am not telling you this story because I wanted to punish her in a hallway. I am telling you because dignity, when you finally use it, does not need an audience to know it landed. In the weeks that followed, the board's investigation confirmed what Maya had already found. Adrian was formally removed from consideration for the chief executive position and separated from the company amid the forged consent findings, and I heard later, secondhand, that 2 other companies quietly withdrew interviews they had scheduled with him once word traveled through the industry. I took no satisfaction in that. I had built a technology to save people, not to end a man's career, and the fact that his own choices did both was not something I needed to celebrate. Serena resigned from her role in corporate communications within the month, not because anyone demanded it, but because she told Raymond she could no longer stand in front of a room and speak for a company whose foundation she had never fully understood. Raymond delayed his own retirement by a year to help rebuild trust with the board and with the clinics whose access had nearly been quietly traded away. He called me twice in the following months, not about business, just to ask, in his own careful way, whether I was doing all right. I told him I was. I mostly meant it. I did not celebrate any of it. I went back to the work I actually cared about, which had never been boardrooms. On my way out that night, Jamal, the young guard who had handed me the temporary badge at the door, caught my eye and gave me a small, uncertain nod, as though he were not sure whether apologizing was his place. I unclipped the badge and handed it back to him without a word, because I did not need it to walk out of that building, and I never had. The days after the party moved strangely. Reporters who had never known my name called Maya's office asking for comment. Junior employees who used to walk past me without a glance suddenly said good morning in the elevator, like they meant it. None of that interested me. What interested me was a short, quiet email from one of the physicians who had been standing in that circle, thanking me for restoring something she said her patients had needed for years and never understood they were about to lose. I drove home alone that night, still in the same navy suit, the blue leather folder on the passenger seat beside me instead of in Adrian's hands. I did not feel like a man who had won anything. I felt like a man who had finally stopped carrying something in silence, which is its own kind of exhaustion, different from triumph, but not unrelated to relief. I sat in the driveway for a long time before going inside, turning the navy pen over in my fingers, thinking about how strange it was that the object Adrian had chosen to humiliate me with had ended up being the same object that told everyone in that room exactly who I was. 6 months later, Helios Meridian Systems launched what they now call the Denise Ellison Access Fund, permanently expanding low-cost diagnostic access to rural and free clinics across the country, funded in part by the very partnership that almost erased that promise entirely. Raymond invited me to the small announcement event, nothing like the anniversary gala, just a modest room of clinic administrators and a handful of board members. I did not give a speech. I stood near the back, the way I always had, and listened to Linda describe what the expanded program would mean for clinics like hers. And for once, the story being told from that stage was actually true. Linda Reyes called me one afternoon, not long after, to tell me a patient at her clinic had been flagged for an irregular heart rhythm using the device, days before any symptom would have shown up in a normal exam. She said the patient was doing fine now. I did not need her to say anything else. Serena sent a letter not long after that, apologizing again, more fully this time. She wrote about the early years, about the woman she had been, before the pastel pink gowns, and she asked, near the end, whether I thought she could ever become that person again. I read it once, folded it, and did not respond. Some questions are not mine to answer. Some things do not require a reply to be understood. I still carry the Navy fountain pen. I stopped by that same free clinic not long ago, stood near the doorway, and watched the machine do exactly what I built it to do 12 years earlier, quietly, without applause, catching something a human eye might have missed. Linda introduced me to the bus driver from her story, a man named Walter who shook my hand for a long time and did not seem to know quite what to say, so he just said thank you twice. I told him he did not owe me anything. The machine did its job because a promise made in a hospital room 12 years earlier had never been allowed to quietly disappear. I thought about Denise on the drive home, the way I do most days now, though the thought no longer arrives only as grief. I thought about how long it took some people in that ballroom to see me clearly, and how little that mattered in the end, because the machine never needed convincing. It simply worked, the way a promise is supposed to. I did not tell this story because I want anyone to admire a signature or a folder or a title nobody in that ballroom knew I carried. I tell it because I spent 12 years being underestimated by people who mistook my quiet for emptiness, and because the moment finally came when the truth did not need me to raise my voice at all. It only needed a piece of paper, a pen I never stopped carrying, and a room finally willing to read what had been true the entire time. So let me ask you this. Have you ever been treated like you had nothing, only because you chose not to show everything? Tell me in the comments.